Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions. As it is, these rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale.
Those words were written by Captain Robert Fulton Scott in a tent on the Antarctic ice. They would make him immortal. Last episode, we left the story at its turning point. Scott arrives at the pole, only to see Amundsen has beaten him to it. He faces a grueling trek back across the ice, with the failure of his attempt hanging over him. Amundsen, meanwhile, has beaten the winter ice, sailed back to civilization, and announced his triumph to the world. As we pick back up today with Amundsen's side of the story, we want to understand: why is Scott's tragic failure more famous than Amundsen's great success? And what role does Scott's incredible final record play in what is remembered and who is celebrated? I'm Hugh Taylor, and you're listening to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Bill, outfitters to sailors, adventurers, explorers and vagabonds for over 500 years. Joining me once again is Dr. Max Jones, historian at the University of Manchester, an author of the compelling The Last Great Quest, the definitive account of how Scott's death became the sensation it did, and what the legend has meant ever since. Later in the episode, we'll return to Scott's final march and those unforgettable and daunting words. But first, the man who beat him. Today, we begin with Roald Amundsen. Max, welcome back to episode 2. The last episode was very much all about Scott. On this one, we want to focus more on Amundsen. Perhaps we could start by telling us a bit about who was he, what was his background. You know, this wasn't his first sort of foray into, the Antarctic or the Arctic.
So Amundsen, an astonishing figure, this supreme polar traveller, born just a few years after Scott. Scott, 1868, Amundsen born in 1872. Quite a wealthy family, but like Scott, he suffers family tragedy, and his father dies when he's just 14, and his mother then dies when he's 21. And he'd begun medical training, but he moves into the world of the sea and the world of exploration. And I don't know if I'm being too reductive with this, but I can't help but see some similarity in that both Scott and Amundsen are dealing with sort of difficult family circumstances and tragedy, and that is at least one of the drivers that pushes them to the extraordinary careers that they have. And Amundsen applies to join the Belgica, Belgian Antarctic expedition at the end of the 1890s, led by Adrian de Gerlache. He gets the bug, if you like. He comes back, he trains, he does scientific studies, he develops his maritime skills, and then he achieves this extraordinary feat of leading the first party to complete a successful crossing of the Northwest Passage.
Beating the British again after the Franklin expedition of decades earlier.
Absolutely. And the power projection point, I should stress that Norway, a new country, a small country, is trying to assert itself on the world stage. And Norwegian nationalists see excelling at exploration as an opportunity to project the power of this young country. And that's certainly firing Amundsen up as well, just as it fired up Fridtjof Nansen on the Fram in the 1890s.
So in episode 1, we obviously almost left the Amundsen story once he'd sent the telegram to Scott and actually he had arrived in the Antarctic. Perhaps start off from where he set up base in the Antarctic and why that also perhaps upset the British
So he sails south. He lands and makes his base camp on the ice, quite close to where the British expedition is, on the Ross Ice Shelf, in an area that's called the Bay of Whales. And this was risky. That area has subsequently carved off into the waters, whereas Scott was going along the route that Shackleton had pioneered to the pole, and thought, I'm a better man than Shackleton, Scott thought, and I'm going to take more dogs, more sledges, and so I'll be able to cover the extra 97 miles and back. That's what he thought. Amundsen has landed, and he's got no idea what's between the Bay of Whales and the South Pole. So it is a risk, it is a gamble, but he's got 120 odd dogs with him, and dogs are the supreme form of polar travel, or the supreme transport for polar travel. And dog lovers, please cover your ears. They're the supreme form of polar travel because they're a portable source of food. They not only pull you along, they pull your supplies along. You can also kill them and eat them.
And also that they get fed to the other dogs as well.
And you can feed them, important point, you can feed them to the other dogs as well. And we should not think that the Norwegians were callous. They formed deep attachments with the dogs, if you read Amundsen's journals, and found it very difficult, but this was the hard reality of attempting to pull off this feat that had never been achieved before.
So Amundsen sets off with the dogs. How many people were with him as well?
So it's him and 4 people.
And how long does it take them to get to the pole?
He goes early, and it only takes them a couple of months to get to the pole. So they're travelling more quickly than Scott, and they arrive in mid-December 1911. They have some hairy moments along the way. There's moments when a dog team goes into a crevasse. That's the principal danger they're encountering, but they survive. And Amundsen plans meticulously. One distinction between Scott and Amundsen, I think, is the marking of supply depots. And again, we come back to this crucial point. In extreme travel, you want to make the situation as easy as you can to reduce anxiety, to reduce decision making. And Amundsen marked his supply depots for the return journey with bamboo poles that he spread out either side of the supply depots. So if you were slightly off course, it didn't matter. You'd see one of the poles, and that would then guide you to the supply depot. Scott, they just had a flag on the tent and some markings around it. And when we read of Scott's return journey from the pole, there is heartbreaking anxiety when, almost starving, they're fighting to get to the next supply depot. So that marking of the supply depots, I think, is an indicator of Amundsen's skill, and the fact that his planning for the killing of the dogs, they didn't take all the dogs to the pole. They took maybe 50 dogs on the expedition itself to the South Pole, and he meticulously planned when they would eat them, and it played out very smoothly.
So he got to the South Pole. I mean, there were a few mishaps, but with relative ease and relatively quickly. And when he got there, obviously, he left the note for Scott and also the letter for the King of Norway. He then headed back and actually got back perhaps even quicker than he got there. They had some pretty good conditions, didn't they?
Absolutely. And the American leading climate scientist, Susan Solomon, did research on the Antarctic weather. And before her wonderful book in the early 2000s, The Coldest March, I'd always thought, well, it's cold, it's Antarctica. But her research showed that Scott's party, travelling a few weeks later than Amundsen's, really did encounter unseasonably cold weather in this period. And the difference in sledging between -20, say, or -40 is tremendous. They very quickly you get to a stage where if your skin is exposed, it's very quick frostbite. The drag of the sledge becomes extremely difficult. So as much as the weight, what you're carrying on the sledge, the conditions of the ice determines how easy man-hauling is going to be. So they didn't know this really at the time, but Scott's team were unfortunate in the extreme conditions they encountered, and Amundsen's team had, in comparison, relatively, it was still a feat. We shouldn't underestimate or downplay the astonishing feat of his successful expedition, which was largely a tribute to his skill in preparation and his talent as both an organizer and as a commander of the men, but was also helped by the conditions that they encountered.
Yeah. And I think he was on record as saying at a later date that the fact it was almost too easy, that people didn't recognize that the endeavor that was required to accomplish it, because he got there in and out so quickly. And apart from, there's one occasion, I think, where they slaughtered 21 dogs in one go. But
Yes, yeah.
apart from that, he'd done everything to keep the public happy, I suppose.
Yeah, and they hadn't lost weight. This remarkable story, because by eating the dogs, they'd given themselves enough fresh meat to carry on. So they were in remarkably good shape when they returned. There's perhaps, this is partly personal, partly to do with the literary traditions that they're operating in. Scott saw himself as a writer. He had ambitions. He was friends with J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, enormously successful. So he had literary ambitions. So he wrote his account of the journey in a particularly evocative way. Amundsen's is more in the style of the drier exploration journal, perhaps as well a certain reticence and modesty in not wanting to exaggerate the conditions that he faced. But I come back to just one thing. I'm hesitant to sort of say that too strongly in terms of the Norwegians are efficient and the British are romantic and just want to create an adventure story, in that I come back to Nansen in the late 1890s, where when he was speaking to a public audience, he knew he had to play up the dangers. So he gave one speech emphasizing the scientific results to the Royal Geographical Society. But then the lecture that he toured round talks about the moment when the kayak drifted away and when they were attacked by a bear and he had to shoot it. So he knew as well, the Norwegian knew as well, that part of the appeal of a story of polar exploration is as an adventure story as well.
So Amundsen gets back to his ship and they manage to get out before it gets frozen in. And
Yes.
They get to, is it Tasmania, where the story is announced?
Absolutely. March 1912, they get to Tasmania, and that's important because we've got what's been called the Victorian Internet, this global network of telegraph cables that's been developed only over the last 50 or 60 years, or the previous 50 or 60 years. And we have this disjuncture at this point when, once you're connected to the telegraph network, you can use Morse code and send the story around the entire world within 24 hours. But when you sail away from the cable head, it's like being today on the dark side of the moon. You're completely out of contact until you plug back in. So he plugs back in 1912, and the announcement is made he's got to the South Pole. A few weeks later, Scott's prearranged this. Scott hasn't returned when the Terra Nova sails to New Zealand. So the Terra Nova brings news. There's a prearranged cable he's written saying, I'm remaining in the Antarctic for another year to continue my work. So most people accept that Amundsen has won the race. Some people are still, we need to wait to hear from Captain Scott to be, can we trust this Norwegian chappie? There's a little bit of that, but not very much, to be honest. So we have this period from March 1912 to February 1913 where we don't know what's happening with Scott, but Amundsen has returned and announced that he has conquered the South Pole and he's fated around the world.
He'd fated around the world, but actually in Norway, there is still some resentment against him for misleading the Norwegian people and the Norwegian king. And then in November of that year, he goes to the RGS in London to deliver a lecture. The RGS, of course, had given him some money to go to the North Pole. And so he'd taken that money and gone to the South Pole. Tell us about the lecture, because obviously Scott's wife was also in the lecture. And at that time, nobody knew what had happened to Scott.
Yes. So we've got this tension. Everyone recognises that Amundsen has performed an extraordinary feat on the one hand. But on the other hand, there's disgruntlement about his concealing what he's done. That's actually damaged the British expedition. But there's also the desire to do the right thing and to celebrate it and to live up to the ideals of British fair play, etc. So the Boy's Own paper publishes a series of articles celebrating Amundsen and raising him as a hero. There's a deliberate effort not to have sour grapes among some British publications. Then we have this Royal Geographical Society lecture. The first snub is not to book the Albert Hall. The Albert Hall had been booked as the prime spot for African explorer Henry Stanley in 1890, for Nansen, for Shackleton. It would be booked posthumously for Scott, but they don't book it for Amundsen, for the man who's conquered the South Pole. They book the Queen's Hall. Still a prestigious venue, but not as prestigious at the Albert Hall. So that's the first snub. And then Amundsen later reported that Lord Curzon had proposed a sneering toast to the dogs, which was meant to denigrate his achievement. Well, this was just to do with the dogs and, it wasn't the proper way of... But he doesn't actually come out with that until later. And there aren't lots of sources for that. So it's not... I can believe that Curzon would say it. So it's entirely plausible. I wonder if Curzon, though, actually said it to him privately in a little conversation and it was a little I don't know.
I think what you're saying is probably the most plausible explanation. It might have been mentioned as a quip or as an aside.
Yeah.
Anyway, he delivers this lecture, and at the same time, everybody still thinks Scott is alive,
yes,
including Scott's wife. So what did happen to Scott?
It's a tragic story. They faced this awful 900-mile journey, man-hauling their sledges back to the base camp. They set off in mid-January. At the beginning, it seems to be they encounter some periods of good weather, and they even stop at one point at the request of Dr. Wilson and do some geologizing and find some rock samples, including finding some fossil specimens which help provide support for the theory of plate tectonics, that Antarctica had been connected. So it seems astonishing now, but then they encounter appalling weather, as Susan Solomon's research has shown. And Petty Officer Edgar Evans, about a month into the journey back, collapses in the snow and dies. And we don't know for sure what happened, but it's thought that he may have had a cerebral edema, and that is what might have ultimately caused him to die. As the largest man, he would also have been suffering most on the polar plateau from calorie deficit as well. So he will have been starving, which will have exacerbated any injury. We have some letters and we have Scott's journal. And Scott's journal reported how around 16th of March, 17th of March. Oates really had hoped he'd die in the night because he had been wounded in the Boer War, and it seems likely that under the stresses, the physical stresses of the return journey, that his war wound opened up. His feet were in such bad shape he was holding them up. So Scott writes, he woke and went out of the tent and said, "I'm just going outside. I may be some time." And then Scott writes, "We knew it was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman." The implication being clear that Oates had sacrificed himself to increase the chances of his comrades of getting through because he was slowing them down.
So Oates has done this incredibly brave act and sacrificed himself for the rest of the team. There was 3 left at this stage, wasn't there?
There were. So we have Bowers, Wilson and Scott. And they're about 120 miles from base camp and about 10 miles from One Ton Depot, which is their next supply depot. But they're almost out of food and fuel. And they camp and they don't leave that camp. There's a storm initially, but my understanding is that these katabatic storms never last longer than 4 days. So it's unlikely that there was a storm that raged for 10 days. But we know that they remained in the tent for 10 days and they all wrote last letters. Scott finished his journal and then wrote an incredible document, a message to the public at the end of his journal. And sometime by the 30th of March, all 3 of them died in the tent. They didn't make an attempt to just, last dash for One Ton Depot. Why? We'll never know. Whether they were simply exhausted, whether they thought it was important to stay together in the hope of being found because they wanted the documents and their supplies and specimens to be found, is impossible to say.
And how much later was it that they were found?
Okay, so you can imagine then the horror of the group back at base. I think 11 people winter in this second winter in the Antarctic back at the base camp. And they keep waiting, but they know how much food and fuel Scott's team have. And really by mid-April, they know that they're not coming. But back at base, they can't do anything. The winter's set in and they've just got to hunker down for the winter. Then the weather improves and they're faced with an awful choice because another party of 6 men is missing, the northern party. But they decide not to look for them. And they all survive, by the way, because they've been living on the coast and they see out in another incredible story that we don't have time to talk about, but I recommend you will search out. Back at the base camp, they decide, no, we need to go south to see if we can find out what happened to the captain. And on the 12th of November, 1912, a search party finds the tent. So they see it's covered in snow. They find the tent with the bodies of Scott, Bowers and Wilson and Scott's journals and all their letters which tell the story of the last march. And on his journals, Scott has written to be read by the finder and then given to my widow. And you may have heard this, but there's an astonishing radio interview with Trygve Gran, this Norwegian ski instructor who Scott had taken on the expedition, who was in the search party, and he describes they had to break Scott's arm because it was across the journal and his companions, and I think he says, yes, there was a crack like a pistol shot. Just this astonishing fragment or detail from the past that you can imagine. So they find the letters and diaries. They then have to wait for the Terra Nova to come, picks them up from back at base on the 18th of January 1913, and the Terra Nova reaches Oamaru in New Zealand, and it's all very tightly controlled, and the Central News Agency has paid for the first cable, and they've drafted on board ship. They've come up with a 2,000 word account, and at Oamaru they're plugged in to the Telegraph network on Monday, 10th of February 1913. And it's over that there's an initial announcement that they're dead. And then on 11th of February, the message to the public, which has been transcribed in full. There's one typo, but other than that, you can see Scott's original. It's transcribed exactly as he'd written it. And that is sent around the world, and it's this global news sensation.
Yeah, and he writes in a compelling fashion as well, doesn't it? The language he uses, it's very emotive. There's a lot of sort of grit, determination against
Yes,
the odds, and it really captures the imagination of the world, doesn't it?
absolutely. You can see it in that the initial reports, a cable comes in, Scott and his companions have died, and you get these formulaic articles which repeat, another set of great British heroes in the frozen south, very formulaic, following the language that's been used to describe polar explorers in the past. And then it's as if a dial on the intensity has been turned up when the message to the public and the account of Oates' death. That's also, they decide to put that in the first cable as well. So right from the beginning, we have both, it's part justification for his decisions to a board of inquiry, and then it's part this elegy of British heroism, of sticking by your mates and sticking it out to the end. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions. As it is, these rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale.
Yeah, it's poetic, isn't it?
It is poetic, and it was treated as a sacred text later, put on display in the British Museum. Arthur Mee edited the children's newspaper for Alfred Harmsworth, and he does a London guidebook in 1937. And he talks about what's on display in the British Museum, and you've got letters from Walter Raleigh and Milton and Shakespeare and Nelson and Wellington and General Gordon. And he writes, but the most dramatic of the treasures in these rooms are the last letters of Captain Scott and Edward Wilson. And that's 1937. So it shows how that story is still resonating before the Second World War, that they remain celebrated as these British heroes.
And it's interesting, isn't it? We talked about 1937, but until perhaps the 1960s or 1970s, obviously Amundsen achieved incredible success, and he was a brilliant explorer, and he was not quite forgotten, but certainly pushed to the edges. Whereas Scott, who failed, he got to the South Pole but came second, was seen as this incredibly heroic figure. And then there was an author called Roland Huntford who basically, I suppose, almost literally character assassinated Scott in, was it the 70s, the 80s?
Yes.
And then it would be great to get your perspective.
No,
because
absolutely.
there's quite a division. So, the Ranulph Fiennes book more recently is a staunch defense of Scott. And part of his reason for the staunch defense is he says, I'm the only author who's been to the South Pole. I know what it's like. This is my defense for Scott.
No, absolutely. 1979, Roland Huntford publishes Scott and Amundsen. And I want to position that as part of a broader debunking in this period, driven by different impulses, but actually the reputations of those old imperial heroes, General Gordon, Kitchener, we can find books which psychoanalyze them and attack them in different ways. Lawrence of Arabia, Richard Aldington's 1955 biography of Lawrence is a sort of convenient bookmark for the beginning of this trend. It's not that they haven't been criticized before. So in Scott's case, lots of people have said he should have taken more dogs. The Norwegians were better at skiing. Lord Curzon himself, in a note in the Royal Geographical Society archives, should have taken more dogs. But no one questions his heroism in death. So there's a sense, yes, he made mistakes as an explorer, but that is outweighed by comradeship and courage that he showed in death and that Oates showed. So Humphrey's contribution is not only to ratchet up all the criticism and show, no, it's not just that he made mistakes, he's an incompetent bungler, a suitable hero for a nation in decline. And he even goes as far as claiming that Scott would sit in the sense staring at Captain Oates, egging him on to sacrifice himself. So Humford, in what remains, I mean, it is a classic and very entertaining, and it did do, even though many people objected to it, it has stuck. I think that sort of criticism still circulates very widely. My view is that I admire the vehemence of the critique in the sense that it's a classic of the genre, but it is not a balanced assessment. Writing as a professional historian, it's a polemic, and one would read it and think, blimey, I wouldn't even cross the road with Captain Scott, let alone go on an Arctic expedition. So I think that the fact that so many people served with him on both the Discovery and the Terra Nova is a very powerful indication that he wasn't the moody idiot that Humford describes. And we've also got lots of testimony of him being charismatic, being compelling, making good decisions, etc. Ranulph Fiennes' book, I think, is more balanced, but I also think he goes too far. He seems to want to defend Scott from every accusation. Forgive me as a university academic, Hugh, but the truth is somewhere in between, surely. I think, for example, given how important the motor sledges were, they took 3 motor sledges to the Antarctic. Scott writes in his journal, oh, the ice is getting a little bit dangerous around the ship. And then the next day, they unload the motor sledges and one of them crashes through the ice and they lose it. And I don't think you can defend that. You can say there are reasons, but, this is absolutely fundamental.
And each one of those motor sledges costs more than all of Amundsen's dogs.
I didn't know that, Hugh. I didn't know that. So on that front, the decision suddenly to take 5 men onto the pole, the marking of the supply depots, there are certain choices that Scott made that I think we can legitimately criticise him for. But where I differ strongly from Humford is, yes, I want to make some criticisms, but I also think that the message to the public is an astonishing document. Someone described it at the time as the most remarkable document ever read by man, which is, I think, a rather good sort of summary of the impact that it had at this time. And to sort of just dismiss it in this way as somehow this evil bungler deliberately trying to use his literary skill to cover things up, I don't find persuasive.
Amundsen was lucky because he just had a very simple, single objective. And no one else was telling him what to do. And, he could get on and do it. And he was brilliant at it. Whereas poor old Scott had, he had so many sort of bosses in effect. He had the Navy, he had the RGS, and he had all these different objectives. And while he was brilliant, I suspect he was appointed because he was politically quite good with all these various organizations, not necessarily because he was the best man for the job.
And I think that's, were there better people? I think it's quite possible. The distinction with Shackleton was undoubtedly extraordinarily sort of charismatic. And I think it was Raymond Priestley who distinguished between them and said, well, for polar travel, you want Amundsen. For science, you want Scott. But if you're in a scrape and you need someone to save you, by God, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton.
That brings this 2-part journey to the South Pole to an end. But if we've given you a taste for more epic polar stories, you can go back and listen to our episode on Shackleton and the Endurance. the tale of what happened when the next great British expedition to Antarctica went wrong. And thank you again to Dr. Max Jones. His previous book, The Last Great Quest, Captain Scott's Antarctic Sacrifice, is out now, but he's also working on a brand new history of British heroes. Look out for that release in the next year or so. Next week, it's back to Antarctica, but this time on the high seas.
That one moment in time, that one critical thing of failure has just taken years of your goals, years of your effort and your focus from you in just like split second. And I knew that I'd just dismasted. And I was 1,000 miles from land in the Southern Ocean and completely on my own.
The Art of Adventure is brought to you by Arthur Beale. That's beale.co.uk. Outfitters to sailors, adventurers, vagabonds and explorers for over 500 years. And for this series, listeners of the podcast can get 15% off any Arthur Beale product at our website. Simply use the code PODCAST at checkout. Please head to arthurbeale.co.uk. This show was hosted by me, Hugh Taylor, and produced by M. Wally. Theme music is by Nassim De Silva.